He succeeds me as Duke of Cornwall and takes on the responsibilities for the Duchy of Cornwall, which I have undertaken for more than 5 decades.
What she did next, the pressure she applied, the position she took, would not just end Andrew's public life as he knew it. It would ripple through every corner of the family, touching his daughters, his grandchildren, even the line of succession itself. It was his birthday. 66 years old, and instead of cake, instead of cards, instead of quiet coffee in a quiet room, he woke up to the sound of a knock that would end everything he had left. Somewhere in that house, whatever peace he still had left ended in an instant, replaced by something he had spent years insisting could never happen to him. February the 19th, 2026. Somewhere behind the walls of a house he no longer had the right to call his own, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was placed under arrest. Not questioned.
My father's first words on entering Westminster Abbey yesterday were a pledge of service. It was a pledge to continue to serve, because for over 50 years, in every corner of the UK, across the Commonwealth, and around the world.
Not summoned for a chat with lawyers present. Arrested. On suspicion of misconduct in public office. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a scandal managed quietly behind closed doors. Not a statement issued at midnight to bury the story before the morning papers. An arrest. Handcuffs, or the modern equivalent of them. Officers at the door of a man who had spent his entire life believing the rules that governed everyone else simply didn't apply to him in quite the same way. This was a man who once stood fifth in line to the British throne. A man who had dined with presidents, who had shaken hands with royalty from every corner of the globe, who had once been untouchable simply because of the name he carried. And on the morning of his 66th birthday, that name meant nothing at all. But here's what almost nobody talks about. This didn't happen overnight. This wasn't some sudden strike out of a clear blue sky. This was the final domino in a fall that had been building, quietly, patiently, for years, and the person who finally pushed it wasn't some outside force. It was family. Hi viewers, quick question before we go further, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. If someone in your own family did something that put everyone else at risk, would you still protect them, or would you be the one to turn them in? I'm asking because that is the exact question that tore apart one of the most powerful families on earth. And the person who finally answered it wasn't who you'd expect. For years, the family closed ranks. That's what royal families do. That's what they've always done. Scandal comes to the door, and the door simply doesn't open. Statements are issued. Silence is maintained. Time is allowed to do what time does, which is make people forget. Think of every scandal you've heard about over the years involving a royal family somewhere in the world. How many of them actually ended in real consequences? How many simply faded, quietly, once the cameras moved on to the next story?
I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me, is the idea of being able to bring some change.
That's the pattern this family had followed for generations. That's the pattern everyone assumed would hold here too. But something changed this time. Something didn't fade the way it was supposed to. It started with a name most people had learned to associate with tabloid gossip and old headlines. Jeffrey Epstein. A name that should have stayed buried in 2019, in 2011, in every year before that. But it didn't stay buried. It kept surfacing again and again, like something refusing to be forgotten. In the middle of it all was a single email. Written back in 2011. Just a few short lines between Andrew and Epstein, casual, almost friendly in tone, the kind of message you'd send to someone you trusted completely. In it, Andrew told Epstein they were in this together and spoke of wanting to do it again soon. Those words sat quietly for years. Until they didn't. Think about that for a second. A private message, written in a moment Andrew almost certainly believed would stay private forever, sitting untouched in some digital archive for over a decade. Waiting. The way so many of these things wait, patiently, until the world finally catches up to them. Because that's how these stories tend to work, isn't it? Not with a single dramatic confession. With old evidence resurfacing at exactly the moment someone thought they were finally safe. In August of 2025, a book landed on shelves across Britain. Entitled, written by royal author Andrew Loney. It peeled back the curtain on the House of York in a way the palace had spent decades trying to prevent. Page after page of research the family could not simply wave away as tabloid speculation. And it was only the beginning. Because not long after, a memoir arrived that the family could not contain, could not spin, could not quietly wait out. Written by a woman named Virginia Giuffre, published after her death, detailing encounters she said happened when she was only 17 years old.
It's terrible that after 50 years it is behind closed doors, and I've no intention. Now I started to stop now. I'm determined to put an end to this.
The walls were closing in. And inside those walls, someone was watching more closely than anyone realized. Queen Camilla. For years, she had stayed out of it. Deferred to her husband. Understood the weight he carried, both as a king and as an older brother trying to hold together the ruins of a scandal he didn't create but couldn't escape either. She held her tongue while Charles fought his own battle, quietly undergoing cancer treatment, doing his best to lead a country while his body worked against him. But something shifted. Something in her changed. Consider the position she was actually in. A woman who had spent her entire adult life learning how to survive public scrutiny, who understood better than almost anyone how quickly a single misstep could undo decades of careful image repair. She had watched her own reputation transform slowly, painfully, over the course of years, from tabloid villain to something closer to respected consort. She knew exactly what it cost to rebuild a name once it had been dragged through scandal. And she was watching Andrew refuse to even try. And what happened next would end up reshaping the entire royal family in ways the public is still only beginning to understand. Because here's the truth nobody expected. The next move didn't come from the palace's lawyers. It didn't come from a press office memo, carefully worded to protect the family name. It came from the Queen herself. By October of 2025, Andrew had been stripped of every title, every honor, every last piece of the identity he had spent 65 years building. He was no longer a prince.
It was anger, and I thought, why is this? Well, it was sort of boy. I thought it was an old man, was probably not a great deal older than me, but...
No longer a duke. Just a man, standing alone in the wreckage of what used to be his life. And when he issued his final statement, insisting he was putting his duty to family and country first, insisting he still denied every accusation against him, something inside Camilla reportedly snapped. She had watched him cast himself as a martyr. A nobleman simply stepping aside for the good of the crown. And she was done pretending to believe it. What she did next, the pressure she applied, the position she took, would not just end Andrew's public life as he knew it. It would ripple through every corner of the family, touching his daughters, his grandchildren, even the line of succession itself. But that's not even the part that will shock you most. Because 3 months after his titles were gone, Andrew and his ex-wife Sarah Ferguson would be forced out of their home entirely. The house they had shared for decades. Gone. And where they ended up next tells you everything about how far the fall really went. I'm going to walk you through exactly how this happened. Step by step. Person by person. Because what took place inside that family over the last year isn't just a royal scandal. It's a story about what happens when loyalty finally runs out. It's a story about a king caught between two roles he never expected to have to choose between, brother and sovereign, family man and head of an institution that answers to an entire nation. It's a story about a woman who spent decades staying quiet and 1 year deciding that quiet was no longer an option. And it's a story about a young prince, still years from the throne he was born to inherit, already carrying more of the weight than anyone outside the palace fully realizes. And Queen Camilla was only getting started. Camilla had spent decades learning how to hold her tongue. That's not an easy thing to admit about a woman who now wears a crown. But it's true. Anyone who watched her early years in public life remembers exactly how much restraint that required, how many headlines she absorbed without ever firing back. She married into a family where silence wasn't just a virtue. It was survival. Say nothing. Wait it out. Let the storm pass, because in that family, storms always seem to pass eventually, given enough time and enough carefully worded statements issued late at night when the news cycle had already moved on. That had been her rule for years when it came to Andrew. She understood the weight her husband carried. Not just as a king, but as an older brother watching a scandal swallow someone he'd grown up with.
By scratching the surface, you get a terrible shock. It's such a heinous crime. People are so shocked by
someone he'd protected instinctively, the way siblings do even when protecting them makes no sense at all, even when every part of the outside world is screaming that the protection has gone on far too long already. Charles was fighting his own battle too. Quietly. Behind closed doors. Undergoing treatment for cancer while trying to hold a fracturing family together with hands that were already full. He had been diagnosed back in early 2024, and by 2026 the palace was carefully describing his treatment as easing, moving into what they called a precautionary phase. But easing isn't the same as gone. Nobody around him would say the word remission. Not once. Not publicly. Maybe not for a long time yet. So Camilla waited. She deferred. She let her husband make the calls, even when, according to people close to the household, she quietly disagreed with almost every one of them. But waiting has a limit. And in the back half of 2025, the limit finally arrived. Let me be clear about something before we go further. None of this happened in isolation. The pressure that finally broke Camilla's decades of patience had been building for years, quietly, in the background, long before most of the public was paying close attention. It started with a book. Entitled, by royal author Andrew Loney, hit shelves in August of that year, and it didn't read like gossip. It read like an autopsy. A methodical, patient account of the House of York's collapse, page after page of the kind of specifics that can't simply be denied away with a carefully worded palace statement issued at 11 o'clock at night. That alone would have been damaging enough for most families. But then came the second blow. And this one was worse. A memoir. Written by a woman named Virginia Giuffre. Published after her death. In it, she described encounters with Andrew when she was just 17 years old. I want to pause here because I know some of you are bracing for details I'm not going to give you. This isn't that kind of story. What matters isn't every claim laid out across those pages. What matters is what happened next, inside the walls of a family that had finally run out of places left to hide. Camilla read it. Everyone in that household did. There was no version of this where it stayed contained to newspapers and morning shows. It landed on breakfast tables inside the palace itself, and it stayed there. And something in her changed. According to people close to the palace, she had been quietly furious for a long time already, long before that memoir ever reached shelves. She has spoken publicly, on the record, about surviving an attack herself as a teenager, an experience she has described in her own words as something that never fully leaves a person. So when she read an account describing a 17-year-old girl and a grown man who was supposed to represent duty and honor above everything else, this wasn't abstract to her. This was personal. Let me say that again, because it matters. This was personal. By October, the pressure inside the palace had reached a breaking point. Charles, weighing his brother's future against the reputation of an institution older than either of them, made his decision. Andrew would be stripped of his titles. Every one of them. No more Duke of York. No more Prince Andrew. Just a man, standing in the wreckage of a name that no longer belonged to him. Here's the part that should stop you in your tracks. Charles reportedly never believed his own family would go this far. He assumed, even after everything, that some version of the old protections would hold, the way they always had before. He was wrong. And by the time he accepted that he was wrong, it was already too late to undo what came next. Because Andrew didn't go quietly. He issued a statement, carefully worded. He said he was putting his duty to family and country first. He said he still denied every accusation against him. He framed himself, in the softest possible language, as a man making a noble sacrifice for the greater good of the institution he claimed to love more than his own name. Camilla read those words too. And according to sources close to the palace, she was furious. Not the quiet, simmering kind of furious she'd trained herself to hide for decades behind a practiced smile at official engagements. This was different. This was a woman who had watched a man refuse, even now, even after everything laid bare in front of him, to simply tell the truth. She had given him the benefit of the doubt for years. Think about how long that actually is. Years of biting her tongue at family gatherings. Years of allowing him a seat at the table others had quietly begun to question. Years of choosing peace inside the household over confrontation, the way most families do, right up until the moment peace simply stops being worth the price. That benefit of the doubt was gone. What she did next didn't make headlines immediately. It happened in private conversations, in closed rooms, in the kind of quiet pressure that never shows up in official statements but changes everything anyway, the way water changes stone, slowly, and then all at once, until the shape of something is simply different than it used to be. She began pushing her husband harder. Publicly distancing the family from Andrew wasn't enough anymore, not for her. She wanted distance that could be seen. Distance that could be felt by anyone watching from the outside, not just implied in the gaps between what the palace chose to say and what it chose to leave out. And she wasn't alone in that pursuit. Standing close behind her, reportedly just as determined, was Prince William. Two people who had every reason to move carefully, to protect the institution quietly the way the family always had for generations, instead chose the opposite path entirely. They chose to push. Together, they became the center of what insiders started calling, almost bluntly, the anti-York faction inside the family. Not a rebellion. Not a coup. Just two people who had decided that quietly, without a single press release announcing it, they became the two people inside that family no longer willing to wait for time to do the work that accountability was supposed to do instead. The house was called Royal Lodge. 30 rooms, set inside the private grounds of Windsor, the kind of home most people will never set foot inside in their entire lives. Sweeping lawns that stretched toward the horizon. A private gate that kept the rest of the world exactly where the family wanted it. History soaked into every corridor, every staircase, every room that had hosted decades of family gatherings the public never saw. Andrew had lived there for decades. So had Sarah Ferguson, his ex-wife, even after their divorce back in 1996, an arrangement that had always struck outsiders as strange but that the family had simply learned to live with, the way families sometimes absorb strange arrangements without ever quite explaining them to anyone outside the walls. By early 2026, that arrangement was over. Andrew and Ferguson were forced out of Royal Lodge entirely. Not asked politely. Not given a graceful, face-saving exit dressed up for the cameras. Forced. The Crown Estate wanted the property back, and after everything that had surfaced in the preceding months, there was no argument left worth making for keeping it under his name any longer. Picture that for a moment. Really picture it. A lifetime of assumed permanence, unraveling in a matter of weeks. A man who once had access to some of the grandest rooms in the country, reduced to negotiating an exit from a house he had assumed, right up until the very end, was permanently his. Boxes. Movers. The quiet, humiliating logistics of leaving somewhere you never planned to leave, carried out under the kind of scrutiny most people never have to imagine. Where did he go? A smaller property, tucked away on the King's own private estate at Sandringham, in the flat, quiet farmland of Norfolk. Modest by any royal comparison. Isolated. The kind of place that seemed almost deliberately designed to keep a man out of sight, and increasingly, out of mind. Neighbors near the estate reportedly noticed the change almost immediately. Fewer cars. No more staff coming and going through the old service entrance. Just a quiet, diminished presence where there used to be constant activity befitting a senior royal household. Ferguson didn't stay in the country at all. She relocated to a retreat high in the Austrian Alps, putting real, physical distance between herself and the family that had once, however reluctantly, called her one of their own for nearly 4 decades, choosing distance and quiet over staying anywhere close to the version of her old life that no longer existed. Let that image sit with you for a second. The Duke and Duchess of York. Gone. Not just from their titles. From the map entirely. One tucked into a small cottage on someone else's land. The other an ocean and a mountain range away, alone with whatever was left of her name. But here's the thing about a family in crisis. While one branch collapses, another has to hold the weight of everything that's left standing upright. That weight fell, more and more, on Prince William. His father was still undergoing treatment. Still fighting. Still working. Still insisting on keeping up appearances and duties despite an illness that doesn't care about royal schedules or state visits or centuries of tradition. Charles had continued hosting world leaders throughout his treatment, including 3 separate state visits in a single year alone, determined, by every account from people who worked alongside him, not to let his reign be defined by a hospital chart. But determination doesn't stop biology. And as Charles's health made certain demands unpredictable, the palace quietly expanded who could legally step in and act on his behalf if he couldn't. Councillors of state, they're called. People legally authorized to carry out royal duties if the monarch cannot. For years, that list had included family members who could no longer realistically serve in that role. Harry, living an ocean away in California, rarely on British soil, and even then, mired in his own security disputes with the Home Office that kept his visits infrequent and complicated. Andrew, disgraced, and now formally stripped of everything that once qualified him to stand in for anyone. When King Charles's office issued its congratulatory message, royal watchers noticed something almost immediately. Something small enough that a casual observer might have missed it entirely, but glaring to anyone who follows these details closely. Camilla's name wasn't on it. Neither, notably, were the Prince and Princess of Wales. Think about what that actually means. A grandchild is on the way. A joyful moment by any normal family standard, the kind of news that should unite even the most fractured households, even if only for a single afternoon. And the Queen chose, deliberately or not, to keep her name off the announcement entirely, along with the 2 people positioned to be the future King and Queen of the country. Sources close to the family suggested Eugenie had actually shared her pregnancy news with Charles privately first, through a handwritten card rather than any official channel, as if she already understood that the usual warmth couldn't be counted on anymore. As if she was quietly preparing herself for exactly this outcome, long before the official statement ever went out into the world. That's not paranoia. That's instinct. The kind of instinct you develop when you've watched your father lose everything, piece by piece, title by title, room by room, and you're left wondering, quietly, privately, how much of that loss is eventually going to land on you too. Because here's what almost nobody was talking about at the time. Eugenie's child isn't just a baby. In a family obsessed with order and hierarchy and succession, that child is also a number. 15th in line to the throne. And that number pushes someone else down the list, whether anyone intended it that way or not. In this case, Prince Edward. A working royal. Someone who has spent years quietly fulfilling duties without controversy, without headlines, without ever once becoming the center of a scandal of his own. And he was displaced, on paper, by a baby born into a branch of the family the institution was actively working to distance itself from. It's a strange kind of collateral damage, isn't it? A child who hasn't even been born yet, already caught in the gravity of a scandal that has absolutely nothing to do with her. She hadn't chosen her father. She hadn't chosen the timing of her pregnancy. And yet here she was, watching her own family's internal politics play out across a press release meant to celebrate new life. Pause on that for a second. A newborn, arriving into a family so consumed by image management that even her place in a centuries-old line of succession becomes a quiet source of tension before she's taken her first breath. And yet, even amid all of this, another source close to the family offered a detail that complicates the entire narrative, the kind of detail that refuses to let this story stay simple. Charles, it was said, remained genuinely fond of his nieces. Not performatively fond, the way royals are sometimes fond of people for the cameras. Actually fond. This wasn't a king who had turned cold toward every branch of the York family without exception. It was Camilla and William, reportedly, pushing for something firmer. Clearer distance. A cleaner break than Charles himself was fully ready to make on his own. Which raises an uncomfortable question, doesn't it? What happens when the people closest to the crown want something different than the man actually wearing it? Let me give you some context here, because this matters more than it might seem at first. Beatrice and Eugenie stopped being working royals years ago. They don't carry out official duties. They don't represent the crown at public engagements the way William or Kate or even Edward and his family do. But they are still, undeniably, family. Still nieces Charles has known since the day they were born, back when their father was simply Andrew, a prince with a promising naval career and none of the shadows that would eventually swallow his name whole. That history doesn't disappear just because a scandal demands distance. And for Charles, according to people who know him well, that history still means something, even now, even after everything. For Camilla and William, apparently, it means less than it once did. Or perhaps more accurately, they've concluded that sentiment can no longer be allowed to outweigh strategy, not when the institution's credibility hangs in the balance every single time Andrew's name resurfaces in a headline. Think about the position Eugenie was actually in during all of this. She hadn't been accused of anything. She hadn't been named in a single document connected to the Epstein investigation. She was, by every account, simply a daughter, watching her father's name become something people flinched at hearing out loud, watching a scandal that predated her own adult life reshape how the institution treated her own family. And still, the snub happened. Deliberate or not, the absence of those names from that announcement sent a message that rippled through royal circles within hours. Commentators who normally focus on fashion choices and public appearances suddenly found themselves parsing a press release line by line, counting names, noting omissions, treating a pregnancy announcement like a diplomatic cable. That's how fragile the family's public unity had become by that point. Every gesture, even ones meant to be warm, was being read for hidden meaning. Every omission was treated as a verdict. It's worth asking what that kind of scrutiny does to a family over time. Every announcement, no matter how personal, filtered through the lens of scandal management. Every celebration shadowed by the question of who gets included and who quietly doesn't. I want you to consider something else too. Beatrice, Eugenie's older sister, had already spent years watching her own father's reputation collapse in slow motion, long before the arrest, long before the stripped titles, long before any of the events we've walked through so far. She had built her own public identity carefully, quietly, largely outside the spotlight, precisely because she understood how quickly a family name can turn from an asset into a burden. Eugenie had tried to do the same. And yet here she was anyway, caught in the same gravitational pull, unable to fully escape a scandal that had nothing to do with her own choices, simply because of whose daughter she happened to be. There's something almost unbearably human about that, isn't there? The idea that you can build your own life, your own reputation, your own quiet distance from a parent's mistakes, and still find yourself pulled back in the moment the family's internal politics need somewhere to draw a line, as though inherited blood carries a weight no amount of personal effort can fully set down. Meanwhile, inside the palace, the debate over how far that line should extend was reportedly still unresolved. Charles wanted warmth preserved where it could be. Camilla and William wanted clarity, consistency, a version of the monarchy where nobody could accuse the family of playing favorites depending on how close a scandal sat to the throne. Neither side was entirely wrong. And neither side was willing, yet, to fully give way to the other. Palace aides, speaking anonymously to reporters in the weeks that followed, described a household where these conversations had become almost routine. Not shouted arguments. Nothing dramatic enough to leak in full. just a steady undercurrent of disagreement that surfaced every time a decision touching the York family came up for discussion, whether it involved security arrangements, invitations to official events, or simply how warmly a statement should be worded. One aide reportedly described the atmosphere as exhausting for everyone involved, Charles included, a king who had hoped, perhaps naively, that stripping his brother's titles would draw a clean line under the entire affair. It hadn't. If anything, it had opened a longer, quieter negotiation over exactly how far the consequences should extend, and to whom. Should a scandal follow a man to his grave, or should it also follow his children, his grandchildren, anyone who happens to share his surname? That's not a question with an easy answer, and the family itself, by every indication, hadn't settled on one either. That's the family the public was watching by the spring of 2026. Not a united front. Not a single, coordinated institution speaking with one voice. A group of people, related by blood and by duty, quietly disagreeing about where compassion should end and where accountability should begin, playing out in the smallest details of a pregnancy announcement that should have been simple and joyful and, for once, entirely uncomplicated. That tension, between a king who still feels the old loyalties and the two people beside him who have decided those loyalties are now a liability, didn't stay behind palace walls for long. It found its way into the streets, in front of the cameras, in a moment neither Charles nor Camilla could control, no matter how carefully they'd planned the ceremony around it. And that's exactly where I'm taking you next. The king's speech is supposed to be ceremony. Tradition. A procession by horse and carriage from Buckingham Palace to Westminster, the kind of image that's supposed to remind the country why the monarchy still matters after all these centuries of continuity. This time, it reminded people of something else entirely. As Charles and Camilla made their way toward Parliament, they weren't met with the usual crowds waving flags and cheering from behind the barriers. They were met with protest. Organized. Deliberate. Impossible to ignore, and impossible to edit out of the footage that would circulate within hours. A group called Republic stood along the route, holding signs, chanting, demanding answers to one specific question. What did King Charles actually know about his brother's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein? That question had been asked quietly for years, in newspaper columns and late-night television segments most people scrolled past without a second thought. This time, it was shouted in the open, on the day of one of the monarchy's most formal ceremonies, broadcast for anyone watching to see, unable to be smoothed over by a palace statement issued quietly the next morning. Let that sink in. No amount of careful staging, no amount of rehearsed royal poise, could fully absorb what was happening on that street. Cameras caught every second of it, and within hours, clips of the protest were circulating far beyond Britain's borders. The King of England, riding toward Parliament in a gilded carriage, centuries of tradition surrounding him on every side, and still, he could not outrun the questions his brother had left behind for him to answer, alone, in front of the entire world. The group behind the protest wasn't new. They'd been growing steadily since the death of Queen Elizabeth, building momentum year after year, gathering the kind of numbers that once would have seemed almost impossible for an anti-monarchy movement inside Britain. And this moment gave them exactly the platform they'd spent years building toward. I want you to sit with the image for a second. Two people, dressed in the full ceremonial weight of 1,000 years of tradition, moving through streets lined not just with well-wishers, but with people demanding accountability out loud, in real time, with nowhere left to hide. That's not a scandal contained behind palace walls anymore. That's a scandal that followed the family into daylight, into the cameras, into the one setting the monarchy has always relied on most to project unity and permanence and quiet, unshakable continuity. Have you ever watched someone try to hold a calm expression while the whole world is asking them the one question they can't answer? That was Charles, that morning, riding past a crowd that refused to let the ceremony simply do its job. And through all of it, Charles kept working, kept appearing, kept insisting, through every single public engagement, that his illness would not define his reign, that he would not be remembered as a king who simply disappeared behind a hospital door. His treatment had been easing, the palace said. Progress was being made, they said. But nobody close to him would say the word remission. Not yet. maybe not for a long time still. So here is where this story leaves us, at least for now. A king, still fighting a private battle no ceremony can fully fix, no matter how many state visits he hosts or speeches he delivers from behind a carriage window with a practiced smile. A queen who broke decades of practiced silence to demand something the family had avoided for years, real distance from a man who refused, even now, even after everything laid out in front of him, to admit what he'd actually done. A son taking on more weight than anyone expected this early in his life, not through some secret takeover in the dead of night, but through the slow, unglamorous reality of a family that had simply run out of other options. And somewhere out there, on a quiet stretch of private land in Norfolk, a man who once stood fifth in line to the throne is living in a modest house he never imagined would be his, stripped of every title he was born into, waiting to see what the next chapter of his legal troubles will bring for him. Think about how far that fall actually traveled. From a palace with 30 rooms to a cottage on borrowed land. From fifth in line to the throne to a name the family's own press office quietly leaves off of pregnancy announcements. From a prince who once believed the old protections would hold no matter what, to a man discovering, slowly and publicly, that they don't. Step back for a moment and consider how unusual this entire sequence really is, even by the standards of a family that has weathered scandal after scandal for generations. Look at everything that's happened since that February morning when Andrew was arrested on his own birthday. In just over a year, a man who once stood among the most protected people on the planet lost his titles, his home, his access, and increasingly, his place in the family's public narrative altogether. Not through a single dramatic verdict handed down in a courtroom, but through a slow accumulation of decisions made by the people closest to him, one after another, each one small enough to explain away on its own, but devastating when added together. That's often how these things actually unfold in real life, isn't it? Not with one clean ending everyone can point to. With erosion. With 100 quiet choices that only look like a single collapse once you step back far enough to see the whole shape of it, the way a coastline only reveals how much it has changed when you compare an old photograph to the one taken today. And at the center of that erosion, more than anyone else, stands Camilla. A woman who spent decades being underestimated, dismissed by some as merely the king's companion, someone whose influence, if she had any at all, surely stayed confined to matters of style and comfort rather than substance. That assumption hasn't aged well. Because when it mattered most, when her husband was too exhausted, too loyal, too weighed down by his own illness to make the hardest calls himself, it was Camilla who stepped into that space. It was Camilla who decided that decades of family loyalty could no longer outweigh the damage one man's choices had caused. And it was William, watching closely, who chose to stand beside her rather than wait for his father to eventually reach the same conclusion on his own timeline. So here is where this story leaves us, at least for now. Because this isn't over. Andrew's case is still moving through the courts. The questions Republic shouted outside Parliament haven't gone away, and they won't, not until someone in that family finally answers them directly, without a prepared statement standing in the way. And there are more documents, more files connected to the Epstein investigation, that insiders say are still working their way, slowly and quietly, toward the surface. What happens if those files name someone else? Someone the public hasn't connected to any of this yet? That question alone is enough to keep palace communications teams awake long past midnight, drafting statements for a scenario nobody wants to happen but everyone privately expects eventually will. And what happens to Andrew himself, once the courtroom doors finally open and the arguments begin in earnest? A man stripped of every protection his name once guaranteed him, facing a legal process with no royal shield left to soften the outcome. For the first time in his entire life, he will stand in front of a judge as simply a private citizen, answerable in exactly the same way as anyone else. That alone should tell you how far this has traveled from where it started. A prince who once believed his name would always protect him, now facing the same system, the same procedures, the same uncertainty as anyone else standing accused. No carriage waiting outside. No crowd of well-wishers. Just a courtroom, and whatever the evidence ultimately shows. I want to know what you think. Type loyalty in the comments if you believe families should stand by each other no matter what they've done. Type accountability if you believe Camilla and William made the right call by pushing for distance instead of protection. And if you're genuinely torn between both, say so. This isn't a simple story with an easy answer, and I don't think it should be treated like one. Because in our next video, I'm taking you inside the courtroom battle that's coming for Andrew, and I'm going to reveal exactly what those remaining files are rumored to contain, and why one name connected to them has palace insiders more nervous than anything we've covered so far. There's a detail in those files, according to sources close to the ongoing investigation, that hasn't been reported anywhere yet. A detail that, if confirmed, could reach far beyond Andrew alone, into corners of the institution nobody has dared to examine publicly. You will not want to miss it. I'm your narrator, and I'll see you there.